OWC Eats, the web series where we talk to the people making food in Southern Alberta. Welcome to the show. Today we're at the workshop at the Lethbridge College Research Farm.
Thank you so much for joining us today, Willemijn. Can you please introduce yourself and tell us what you do?
My name is Willemijn Appels. I am a research chair at Lethbridge College and I run a research group in irrigation science.
Tell us, what do you think the biggest challenge for irrigated agriculture is right now?
Irrigation and water use in the agriculture sector in general, it's the trying to match the increased importance of irrigated agriculture in Alberta because it produces really good yields, because it produces extra, more diverse sort of crop type, and matching that importance to the economy and to the province in general. And the fact that water resources are limited. We don't have an endless pot of water to draw from every year. There's probably not going to be any more water. And the amount of water that we can take out the river system every year for agriculture in the southern part is limited as well. To do more or the same or better quality stuff with the same amount of water is an ongoing challenge.
Where does the water come from that the irrigators use in Southern Alberta?
Most irrigators are in the Oldman and the Bow river systems. It's snowmelt water. It melts in the spring. Usually irrigation districts try to capture a whole bunch of that water in reservoirs. Then during the growing season, they distribute it to farmers through a system of canals and pipelines. There's also private irrigators who basically have to take care of their own water supply. They would pump straight out of the rivers. There's some smaller locations, and there's some water coming from the Red Deer for other areas from the Ross Creek system in the southeast of the province.
And how much of the water in the Oldman Watershed is used for irrigation?
Well, that would be about 90%.
It decides how much water each irrigator can use.
There's a system in place in Alberta that in order to be allowed to use water for a certain purpose, be it industry or manufacturing or agriculture, you have to get a permit. For about 80% of all irrigation farmers, that happens at a larger scale. We have irrigation districts that are basically groups of farmers that have one big water license, and that license determines the volume of water, the amount of water that they can take from the river system every year. And depending on whether it looks like that volume is available in the spring, the irrigation district will tell the farmers in the district, okay, you can use an X amount of inches or millimeters of water to grow your crop this year.
You mentioned water availability is the biggest challenge to irrigated agriculture. How are farmers addressing that? How are they trying to get around that limit?
That happens at two levels. First, you have the districts who try to make sure that all the water that they take out of the river system that also actually ends up at the farm. Traditionally, that would be done through canals. Over the years, that has changed a lot, from earth canals that are leaky on the top and at the bottom to through like lined canals with either concrete or plastics, to a full transition of burying pipelines instead of having to move water through a canal or a ditch completely. So in that case, you no longer lose water back to the air through evaporation. You also don't lose water anymore that leaks into the ground. That's a really big piece. The second piece is what farmers can do and have done for the last, let's say, 3 decades on farm, is to move from methods of irrigation that require you to put a lot of water on at one time to methods that put just less water on. So you can really meet what the crop needs. Previously, you had flood irrigation where you would just literally put a layer of water over an entire field and let that infiltrate. Because that's so much water, the chances are really high that part of that water just infiltrates into the bottom, bypasses the roots, and ends up deep down into the soil. It might recharge the groundwater, which is great, but that's not why we took it from the river in the first place. At the moment, about 85% of all irrigated land is irrigated with center pivots. So those are the ones that go around in circles. 85% is then also irrigated with low pressure. So you use less energy, you have a lower flow rate, and you put out fairly small amounts of water, maybe an inch at a time or 25 millimeters at a maximum. Going to the full end of the spectrum, you have something like drip irrigation, where instead of sprinkling water over top of your crop, you're dripping water from a line buried underground. You have no losses of water that was sort of left in the leaves and evaporated from there, or water that got blown away by the wind or evaporated. That's the most efficient way. You're burying something underground, which may interfere with the other agricultural practices that a farmer has to do every year. Or if you grow potatoes, you rip open the soil and you do quite a bit of work making all those nice hills. In those cases, the best thing for water application doesn't match with the best thing for your crop operation.
What kind of irrigated crops are grown in Southern Alberta?
Traditional crops that you can grow without irrigation, wheat, canola, barley, pulses, you can grow them with irrigation as well. Having control of the water allows you to grow crops like sugar beets and potatoes, higher value crops that you spend so much money sort of growing right from the beginning that you don't want them to fail halfway because they dried out.
How do you think agriculture will be different in 20 to 30 years?
There's even more automation and computers in the combines, in the tractors, but also in the water supplies, and have a bit of trouble figuring out what the best balance is between putting out fertilizer and pesticides and protecting the environment and making sure that we generate a product that doesn't put an excessive burden on our natural landscape. Climate change and the weather will probably still be, they will be the main factor in figuring out, in determining whether or not you get what you have to do every year, and it'll just get more complicated.
How has climate change affected how irrigators are growing crops right now?
At the moment, the effect is not very large. Drought and periods of wetter weather have always sort of exchanged in Southern Alberta. Our climate is highly variable. At the moment, we still have good snowpacks right at the beginning of the growing season. If snow no longer falls as snow but as rain in the mountains, then the water will move immediately out of the way. You then either have to just let it go and let it flow on to Saskatchewan, Manitoba, or you'd have to find new ways to capture it in reservoirs, which means building dams and everything. That's happening a little bit already. The disconnect between when the water is there and when we need the water to grow crops, that disconnect will only increase. I think irrigation sector and farmers will try to sort of bridge that gap, maybe even store water if they can't do it in reservoirs on a district level.
What are some ways that irrigators are trying to protect the environment and find that balance?
We do try to match inputs with what the land can handle. People will be soil sampling, making sure that they don't over-fertilize when there's still a lot of fertilizer left in the soil. In terms of water applications, you can sort of figure out beforehand, depending on based on the weather forecast, how much water your crop is going to need in the coming days or week, and then set your schedule for irrigation on that need. Use tools like moisture sensors, or just sort of surveying your fields and figuring out where you have excess water. If you have a snowpack and it melts in the field, then you'll probably get more water in the lower areas, less water in the drier areas. There is technology available with which you can sort of respond to that difference in the reservoir that you can tap into. That helps out for a couple of irrigation events, but it's never really enough to sustain you through an entire season. That the most important thing is that you are, as a farmer, you're very aware of how much water you will need, how much water you have, and try to bring those two together and close the gap through irrigation.
Can you tell us a little bit about your research?
I work at Lethbridge College and we focus on applied research. So we don't per se ask questions that only satisfy our curiosity. We try to figure out, okay, what's an actual problem for people working in irrigation or in irrigated agriculture, and then design projects around that and see if we can find answers to those problems. A lot of our work looks into how we can use new equipment and new technologies to come up with better ways to manage water on the farm. We have access to a research demonstration farm just east of Lethbridge, where we can experiment with these tools, figure out how they would work best, how you can handle them in the best way possible, and find out how much data you have to collect to, for instance, do irrigation applications where you really water only the parts that are dry and you skip the parts that are wet. We also run tests with the subsurface drip irrigation that we talked about earlier. Figure out, okay, well, how can we optimize the drops of water that we put onto a field to the best possible extent.
So do you think in the future irrigation will be even more efficient than it already is?
It could be. There is a limit, because in order to grow, a plant just needs water. And if our growing seasons are getting longer, then a plant will need more water to grow from start to finish. But there can be ways to really nail down when you apply it and where you apply your irrigation water to make that as efficient as possible. And then potentially biologists, geneticists could breed varieties or crops that are just a little bit more resistant to drought, or better equipped to handle lower water conditions.
So with subsurface drip irrigation, because the pipes have to go underneath the soil, what crops can it be used for and what crops can it not be used for?
It can be used on all crops that you harvest above the ground. So wheat, cereal, other cereals, canola, corn, beans, whatever. But it's difficult if you have a part of the plant that's underground that you're interested in. So sugar beets, potatoes, you all have to dig those up because that's what you sell at the end of the... Percentage-wise, you could probably grow a lot of the Alberta crops on this subsurface drip system. But then often you grow that in a rotation. So a field has in 1 year potatoes, the next year cereal, maybe beets, maybe canola, and then another cereal, and then you come back with the potatoes. The drip lines you have in place forever. You have to find fields where you don't have those root crops. It's not a solution for the entire province or for the entire agricultural region, but it has a place.
If the barrier to using subsurface drip irrigation is crop rotation, as to not strip that ground of nutrients, what would need to be solved in order to use that for a greater number of crops?
Well, it would mostly be to find a way that's economical, that you could roll up the lines when you take out your potatoes or when you have to put them in. You would either have to come up with rotations where you don't grow these root crops that are buried underground, right? Or find a way to put it in place and take it out of the ground that makes sense from an economic and also from an environmental perspective, because putting them into the ground is not easy. If you have to run a tractor 3 times extra over your entire field because you have to put your drip lines in and take them out again, then that probably offsets the carbon and emission and fuel use, probably offsets what you were gaining in water.
So it sounds like as the climate warms and the growing season is longer, we're going to see more water use, and there's ways to try to be more efficient with the drip irrigation. So that's an important kind of exciting piece that hopefully will help with the limits we have on water. And then you mentioned that technology is also helping, where the tractors are programmed to know the moisture, know the nutrients in the soil, so that they're only putting in what is needed with the pivots or the tractor. Are there other things that you see in the future, or are those kind of the 2 primary innovations that are happening now that are going to protect our water supply and our soil?
I think those are the most sort of important tools that we have to deal with or to optimize what we do. And they're the tools that you really have at your disposal on the ground. Whoever is working the land has access to those tools or should have access to those tools. The other piece is that observation, remote sensing from higher distances, the modeling and prediction and forecasting that comes with that is getting way better. So sure, a weather forecast is still not very reliable for more than a week ahead of time, but if you combine a weather forecast with, say, a full soil moisture inventory of the entire province or the entire country based on satellite observations, now you have information with which you can potentially make larger scale decisions. So let's say that we have a drought crops in two regions look very poor, could you save the season by directing all your effort into one of those two regions, and instead of trying to spread it out over both? I mean, in all cases, there's always, to that kind of decision, there's always a political and a human component that's not easy, and as a physical scientist you don't necessarily think of that, but we can probably collect the data and the observations to make those decisions if they are necessary.
Well, especially in an emergency situation, like what we see probably every few years now in the Tabor region, where they get smashed by hail or something. And so if you have an emergency situation there, maybe you can rebalance your resources to save somewhere that maybe could still make it.
Well, it's really interesting and I think hopeful for our region. Like, we're so dependent on agriculture for our economy and processing those crops in our cities and our towns. I think that gives us a lot of tools to work with, like you said, as in the future things getting drier and warmer. It's really exciting to know that there are these innovations happening.
Yes, there's still so much development, like especially in that technology world happening in the agricultural sector. It's not a very dark time looking ahead per se. There's a lot of innovation that we can work with and that we can use to be more sustainable in our large-scale production. I think optimism is the right feeling that we could have about that.
Yeah, and it seems to me, like with you talking about the better data leads to better decisions, lower use of pesticides, lower use of fertilizers because it's more targeted to where it's needed. That has a lot of positive benefits for water quality, and stormwater runoff isn't as polluted and things like that. So it's not just about water use. There's all these kind of co-benefits as well with improvements and using those tools. Yeah,
for sure. And we're lucky in the sense that we have first dibs on the water as it comes out of the mountains, right? So it's so clean and of nice quality when it moves into our system. And if we can do more to make sure that it sort of leaves at the same level of cleanliness, that would be really great.
Exactly.